Hello everybody and welcome to a very special edition of Between Two States. My name is Bill Frankmore and I'm very honored to be joined by Dr. Charles Goldman. Many of you may know him as the Godfather of Lake Tahoe. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll do a COVID air fist bump. I want to read your bio a little bit, but it would take about 20 minutes. Right. For those who aren't familiar with his work, Dr. Goldman, a distinguished professor of Limnology Emeritus in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy with the University of California, Davis from 1958 to 2010. He developed the first courses in limnology and oceanography at UC Davis, served as the chair of the Division of Environmental Studies, was founding director of the Institute of Ecology. He's won, of course, numerous awards, but just to name a few, the Nevada Medal and UC Davis Distinguished Professor Award in 2003, and a very big award also won by Dr. Goldman in 1998, the prestigious Albert Einstein World Award of Science. So that's just a few. So Dr. Goldman, we are very pleased to have you with us today. Thank you so much for coming.
Oh, great to be here. Thanks for doing this interview.
You bet. We're talking about preserving Lake Tahoe and the long journey it's been. You've been there through much of it. Take us back through the history of Lake Tahoe science, especially the UC Davis, your group there, the Tahoe Research Group. How has that greater understanding impacted how we protect the lake today?
Well, it really goes back further than that. It goes back to the mid-1860s when Tahoe was essentially clear-cut. The lumber was almost totally removed to shore up the silver and gold mines in the Comstock. So the basin was pretty well denuded, and it's possible with what we call paleolimnology.
You're going to have to break that down for us.
Well, taking cores of the sediments of Lake Tahoe, you can reconstruct the sediment loading history. And certainly in the 1860s, Tahoe went through a real dive in terms of water quality.
Can you give us an idea, when you say it went through a dive, how much of a dive? What are we talking about as far as?
Well, it probably lost half the transparency that it had. It recovered as the vegetation reclaimed the disturbed land, the forest grew back, the sedimentation dropped off, the nutrient loading quit, and Tahoe recovered its remarkable transparency that John LeConte, who eventually became president of the University of California, measured at the end of the 18th century. He took a dinner plate, lowered it down until it disappeared, pulled it up again. It was a copy of the Secchi disc, which was invented by the Papal Navy, by Father Secchi. So it was a good measure, simple, no moving parts. You just watch it disappear and then reappear. And that's a good measure of transparency.
And what was it at its peak? Do you remember?
Well, it was over 100 feet.
Mm-hmm. Give me your first impressions when you first saw Lake Tahoe.
It's beautiful, cobalt blue. And I realized at that moment that people were coming to Tahoe more and more, and particularly with the Olympics. And this made me think that it was going to be in danger, and got me started right off on making the long-term measurements, which now are probably the longest-term continuous measurements of any lake in North America.
Right. And when you first came over the hill and saw Lake Tahoe, this was in the late 50s?
1958.
Okay. And then they had the Olympics in 1960 up at Squaw, but you knew this was going to be a place that people were going to want to be.
The lakes already in the Midwest were beginning to suffer from this process we call eutrophication, loading with nutrients, lots of algal growth, going green, and essentially destroying water quality.
Yeah. What was the attitude, though, concerning preserving Lake Tahoe, keeping it that cobalt blue?
Well, there really wasn't much concern at the time I arrived. It was sort of the Western attitude that the West is here to conquer, and of course there was a huge urge for development. They wanted to put a bridge across Emerald Bay. There were numerous plans for markets and various development projects. Had nothing occurred in terms of control, I think Tahoe would have been a lost cause in a decade or so.
Wow. Talk about the attitude and how it's changed over the 6 decades of your Tahoe experience and preservation efforts.
A lot of resentment to anybody controlling development. This sort of culminated in what do we call those things where you get people together, town hall meetings.
Yeah, okay.
And people would just wrap themselves in the flag and demand that development not be impeded in any way. And over the years, they just kind of talked their way out of it, and they eventually came to the realization that if Tahoe's quality was degraded, everybody would lose.
Right.
And that was the turning point, particularly when the real estate developers understood that the value of their parcels would be depleted if there was a quality decline for the lake.
There was a huge push after you had the summit with then President Clinton and Vice President Al Gore. Talk about that moment in time and how it impacted Lake Tahoe and people's thoughts about the need to preserve this beautiful lake.
We were successful in convincing him to go out on the John LeConte, our research boat named for the guy that made the first measurements of transparency in Tahoe, along with Al Gore. And there was no competing news at the time, so people all over the world saw Clinton and Gore out on Lake Tahoe, and it really set the world stage for Tahoe being sort of the picture book of a lake that people got to soon enough to save. And I think that, more than anything else, put Lake Tahoe in the world spotlight.
If there was one measure that has started to bring back the clarity at Lake Tahoe, what do you think it would be? The
really important thing was getting the sewage out of the Tahoe Basin. At that time, advanced wastewater treatment, AWT as it was called, was very fashionable. Energy was cheap. You could get sewage water down to almost drinking water quality. And so the plan was to convert the South Tahoe plant to an AWT, Advanced Wastewater Treatment Plant, and that seemed like a really logical thing to do. What they didn't realize, and again where science was so important, the ammonia went right through that plant. And at the time, Tahoe was a classic western lake, limited in terms of algal growth, or fertility if you like, by the availability of nitrogen. So I took mid-lake water, added tertiary treated effluent from the plant to this mid-lake water in cultures and turned it green in 3 days. And this convinced this elite group of engineers, which were keen on an AWT plant, that they couldn't actually put the treated sewage back into Tahoe and had to sewer the lake and export the sewage from the basin, which was the single most important thing I accomplished.
And the seeing was convincing at that point.
Yeah. Seeing was convincing. It's nothing like a culture of beautiful, clear Tahoe water turning green with a tiny bit of effluent from a tertiary plant.
You've ran into some dicey situations in your efforts to preserve the clarity and do the science at Lake Tahoe, including threats. And take us a little bit back through the history where they didn't want some scientists in the way of their development or making money.
You know, back in the days of the Rat Pack and some mafia influence on the North Shore. And after some of these really contentious meetings, I had a Firebird Pontiac at that time. I'd lift the hood and check for dynamite under the manifold after leaving those meetings because I got threatening telephone calls. And
Did you ever find out who those phone calls were from?
No, but they sounded really hostile.
I imagine some colorful history on the North Shore, of course.
Keeping your cool is really important when you're dealing with a long-term problem like that.
Yeah.
And we'd just been able to get the 2 governors of the states, and that was with the League to Save Lake Tahoe. They took me along as the expert to meet first with Reagan and then with Paul Laxalt. And both governors agreed that we needed a bi-state agency, and this was incredibly important to maintaining the quality of the lake as we have it today.
Yeah. What do you think is your most important relation to the Tahoe Research Program?
Well, certainly when you run an operation, as I did as a director of the Tahoe Research Group for those 52 years, you stand on a lot of shoulders, and I've had wonderful students. Many of them did their PhD research on Lake Tahoe or Castle Lake, which we studied really in parallel with Tahoe. Sudeep Chandra is now a professor at the University of Nevada, and Alan Havert is a professor with the Desert Research Institute. Jim Elser is director of the Flathead Lake, Montana Laboratory. And those, I call them youngsters, but gosh, they're not youngsters anymore, are going to carry the torch.
Doctor, you've been talking a lot about limnology. What exactly is limnology?
Well, limnology is really aquatic science. It's an equal mixture of physics, chemistry, and biology, leading to a better understanding of inland waters. It's really, when people used to ask me what limnology was, the quickest thing I could say, well, it's inland oceanography.
What's your biggest fear moving forward with protecting Tahoe?
Well, right now, climate change is just an overwhelming concern. Tahoe is really threatened by climate change. The creation of the Tahoe Keys resulted in a small warming environment, which is sort of a precursor for what could happen to Tahoe as a whole. Warm water fish got in there. They have now spread around the lake along with the Eurasian milfoil, which is an exotic invasive weed that people dumped into the Keys along with their goldfish, largemouth bass, and bluegills, which are now found around the lake. Wow. But people have not really recognized how we have a feedback loop in climate change that's been underestimated. It's important to realize that the warmer it gets, the climate, the faster it gets warmer.
Any parting thoughts as we enter into the future here?
I think people are beginning to realize that everybody loses if the water quality in Tahoe continues to decline.
What is your advice to scientists as they continue to study Lake Tahoe moving forward?
I would certainly encourage any students to get into biology, ecology, limnology. Life is short. It's important to do something you really like, and I was tremendously fortunate in getting the job at Davis right out of the University of Michigan and discovering that Tahoe needed a limnologist, and I was there.
And you were there for quite a while, 1958 to 2010, and the work you've done, couldn't commend you enough for that and helping to preserve our beautiful lake in our backyard.
That's kind, but it's been a work of love. You can't help loving that lake.
Dr. Goldman, thank you so much. We'll go back to the air fist bump. Please come talk to us again soon, hopefully after all this is over.
Anytime.
All righty. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. You've been watching Between Two States. We hope to see you very soon.